Chapter 15, Occupied Europe, 1794 to 1799. Pitt's decision to send a squadron to the Mediterranean in the spring of 1798 was a bold gamble. It involved depleting the Channel Fleet by 8 capital ships, leaving it with far from overwhelming superiority to the known strength of the French Navy in the western ports. And when the order was sent out on 29 April, the British cabinet had known for 6 weeks that an uprising was imminent in Ireland and that its leaders expected French help. The French had proved in December 1796 that they could mount a major expedition against Ireland and elude the British fleet. Only bad luck had prevented them from landing. 3 months later, they actually did land a small force of released convicts and desperadoes on the coast of Pembrokeshire in the hope that they might launch a British chouannerie. They were soon rounded up, but the fragility of British command of the seas stood exposed. All this immeasurably encouraged Irish revolutionaries. Since 1795, the United Irishmen had worked to establish a country-wide organization by integrating themselves with the network of agrarian secret societies, the Defenders, which had grown up over the preceding decade. The Defenders were not much interested in politics, originating in sectarian rivalry for land in Ulster. They had become general redressers of rural grievances with overwhelmingly local concerns. But they inherited age-old traditions of French help. And as soaring population, poor harvests, and economic disruption resulting from the war brought increasing hardship to the Irish countryside, they seemed ripe for integration into the insurrectionary plans of Ireland's urban radicals, who were now dreaming of national independence. Though the failure of Hoche's expedition disappointed them, it fired their hopes for the future. Numbers taking the United Irish oath soared in 1797, and as the British fleet mutinied, they impatiently awaited a new French landing. In fact, there was little hope of that, especially after Hoche died in September. Remembering how Ireland had failed to stir even when the 1796 expedition had appeared in Bantry Bay, French strategists wanted tangible evidence of a rebellion rather than promises before even thinking of a further attempt. And while such mutual misunderstandings bedeviled hopes for an Irish revolution, the Dublin government took vigorous measures to preempt any uprisings by disarming the most suspect areas. Starting with Ulster in the spring of 1797, it allowed an undisciplined soldiery to terrorize the countryside with floggings, burnings, and torture. The yield of hidden arms was so encouraging that these methods began to be applied further south. The United leaders began to fear that their organization would be broken before it could act. On the vaguest rumors that the French were planning to come again in 1798, they resolved to rise. But informers had leaked their plans to the government. And on 12 March, the Dublin leaders were arrested. When second-rank members precipitated a rising in Leinster in May, it was squashed within days. So was another outbreak a few weeks later in Ulster. But by then, sectarian panic had spread south to Wexford, a hitherto tranquil area where no activity had been expected. Their Catholic bands, whose numbers soon reached 20,000, massacred Protestants and repelled inadequate military units sent against them. A ragged rebel army marched north, but instead of breaking out of the locality, encamped on Vinegar Hill. There, just 3 weeks after the Wexford outbreak began, they were pounded to pieces by heavy artillery. By the end of June, the rebellion was over. Or almost. News of its early success, however, had by now reached Paris, and desperate attempts were made to cobble together new task forces to help the rebels. Eventually, just over 1,000 men landed at Killala in remote Mayo on 22nd August. Hundreds flocked to join them, although the godless French were bemused to find themselves identified as soldiers of the Blessed Virgin. Some skirmishes were even won as the force marched inland to where United Irishmen, thin on the ground in Connacht, were reputedly massing. But by September, there were 30,000 government troops in Ireland, and a third of them confronted General Humbert on 8 September at Ballinamuck. After token resistance, he surrendered. Other, smaller expeditions sent from France in the meantime fared no better. One of them contained Wolfe Tone, who was brought in chains to Dublin and only evaded execution by cutting his own throat. The Irish uprising of 1798 never had any real chance of success. Much of Ireland was untouched by it, and many of those involved had only the vaguest notion of what their French allies stood for. The latter had neither the resources nor the commitment by 1798 to support it as it would have required for Ireland to be detached from the British crown or merely become, as many of them dreamed, a British Vendée. But unless the Polish struggle of 1794 against the partitioning powers is counted, it was the largest pro-French uprising of the Revolutionary decade. It terrified both the Protestant ascendancy, who ruled Ireland, and their backers in London, who had little to cheer them until news of Nelson's victory arrived at the beginning of October. And although not comparable in concentrated savagery with the carnage in Warsaw on 4th November 1794, it produced 30,000 victims in 3.5 months, a similar number to the terror in France, but over a shorter period, and from a population barely 1/6 the size. And if, at this or some lesser cost, it had succeeded, the objectives of the peasant rebels, their educated urban leaders, and their French allies were far from clear or mutually compatible. The United Irish conspirators liked to imagine that, having helped them to freedom, their French liberators would leave them alone to seek their own destiny. Undoubtedly, Wolfe Tone told a French general in July 1796, "The French must have a very great influence on the measures of our government in case we succeed, but if they were wise, they would not expect any direct interference." Optimistic to the last, Tone discounted the general's ominous response. It might be necessary, as it was actually in Holland, where, if it were not for the continual superintendence of the French, they would suffer their throats to be cut again by the stadtholder. The Dutch Republic was the only region reached by the French armies where sympathizers with the revolutionary cause were at all common. Patriots driven underground since 1787 and ordinary people outraged at the undisciplined behavior of British and Prussian soldiers brought in to prop up William V, welcomed the French ummies initially as liberators. The punitive peace treaty of 1795 came as a shock, but one whose impact those who now took power in Holland hoped would pass. Adopting the slogan liberty, equality, fraternity, at a time when it was being washed off buildings all over France. The first sister republic set about endowing itself with a more rational and democratic constitution than the age-old Union of Utrecht. But it took almost a year to decide how this should be done. And when eventually it was agreed, under mounting French pressure, that the means should be a national convention rather than the traditional Estates General, the body elected in March 1796 was soon immobilized by quarrels between advocates of a unitary state and Federalists. More radical elements favored unity, and when the objections of more traditionally minded deputies brought discussion to an impasse, patriot clubs tried to bring pressure on the convention in the well-tried Parisian manner. One of the most spectacular of these episodes was the mutiny of certain Amsterdam National Guard units against the conservative city authorities early in May. It was thwarted without loss of life, but coinciding as it did with the exposure of Babeuf's conspiracy in France. It alerted the occupying Ummy to the dangers of Dutch radicalism. Closer French control of the Botvian Republic, as Wolfe Tone was told a few weeks later, was evidently necessary. Okay, for the first time ever, there are like 3 huge roosters out there from the neighbors. I don't know what they're doing. They've never been out there before, but I just hope the dogs don't get hurt. Those roosters are huge. They're bigger than our dogs, man. Unbelievable. Okay. From then on, the French applied steady pressure in favor of a unitary solution, and their troops were increasingly conspicuous on the streets of the major cities. Yet the eventual draft constitution, finalized in May 1797, fudged the federal issue. Submitted to a plebiscite the following August, it pleased nobody, and common endorsement by the French ambassador sealed its fate. It was rejected by 108,761 votes to 27,955. A new convention was therefore elected to begin the task afresh. But once it was soon stalemated. By now, the Fructidor coup in France had removed the men of caution from the Directory and the councils, and the great nation was more inclined than ever to assert its authority over its clients. The destruction of the Dutch fleet at Camperdown only confirmed the contempt felt in Paris for the ineffectiveness of the Batavians. Fructidor itself offered a model for how to get out of a political impasse, and it was eventually followed. On 22nd January 1798, 22 Federalists were expelled from a convention surrounded by troops under French orchestration. Others resigned in protest. A provisional directory was proclaimed to handle the Republic's affairs until a constitution took effect. A draft of such a constitution had in fact already been prepared, and over the next few weeks, only a few minor amendments were made. In April, it was put to another referendum, and this time it was accepted. 2 years after the French conquest, therefore, the Dutch ancient regime was at last swept away. The Estates General in the provinces they represented went the same way as the Stadtholderate. So did the once powerful guilds, the oligarchical, self-perpetuating city councils, and the established church. The Batavian Republic was now to be one and indivisible, organized into 8 roughly equal departments. A bicameral legislature, elected by all male citizens earning a living, would make the laws in turn. The legislature would select an executive of 5 directors. It was a far more democratic constitution than any adopted in France during the 1790s. But then, the Dutch had practiced representative government of a sort for centuries before 1789. And the Constitution's drafters felt confident in leapfrogging the relative novices who had given them the chance to build on their traditions. What they did not feel confident of was the continuing support of their fellow citizens. Those purged in January were kept in prison, and their supporters throughout the country were now systematically ejected from all posts of influence. And in May, with French support, they decided to guarantee their constitution by the same means the convention in Paris had used to launch the Constitution of the year number 3, by perpetuating themselves. They decreed that the first elections would only choose 1/3 of the new legislature. The other deputies would be made up of themselves to be deemed already elected. The result was uproar. The press, enjoying a freedom also long established in Dutch tradition, denounced the cynicism of the new directory. From Paris, it began to look as if once more the Dutch had failed to establish revolutionary stability. Having dealt with resurgent Jacobinism at home in the coup of Floreal, the French government was now keen to curb radical excesses elsewhere, abandoning Delacroix, the ambassador who had orchestrated a year of French intrigue at The Hague. They raised no objection when the Daendels, an ambitious Dutch general, launched a coup against the Batavian Directory. Having quarreled publicly with his political masters on 16th of May, Daendels ostentatiously traveled to Paris to lobby higher authority. He returned on 10th June a popular hero, cheered by all the regime's now multifarious opponents. And while a new French commander, Joubert, stood obligingly aside, on 12th June, Daendels and his men cashiered the Directory and arrested the most vocal members of the legislature. Amazingly, Daendels did not seize power for himself. He handed it over at once to those imprisoned since January. They disclaimed all desire to perpetuate themselves too. Instead, they called elections, and by the end of July, a new legislature was in session. The constitutional life of the Batavian Republic began at last to function normally, and it did so with regular elections until yet another new regime in Paris decided it was unsatisfactory in the spring of 1800. Whether it would have gone on unmolested for even that long without the difficulties France was now experiencing elsewhere with the renewal of war seems doubtful. Dutch political life remained volatile, and the Republic persistently failed to live up to the standards of support and subservience expected by the great nation of its little sisters. For their part, fewer and fewer Dutchmen felt much benefit from the association. "What fruits until now?" asked a moderately patriotic newspaper founded in the summer of 1798. "Have the people plucked from the Liberty Tree, planted in the winter of 1795? To tell the truth, not much. The intervening years had brought heavier taxation and added defeat on the sea to that already sustained on land. In August 1799, an Anglo-Russian force landed in the north after the mutinous remnants of the Dutch Navy surrendered to a British squadron with William V's son on board. Only 10,000 French troops were by then stationed in the Republic, although it was still paying under the 1795 treaty for 25,000. A joint force eventually defeated the invaders and compelled their withdrawal. but only after 2 months of fighting, in which the British confirmed their reputation as pitiless marauders. And war against the island state had meanwhile brought ruin to Dutch trade. Overseas colonies were ruthlessly picked off, and the Republic's ports were blockaded. Colonial goods, so basic to many of the industries built up in the Republic, over 2 centuries were either cut off or only got through an exorbitant cost. Shipbuilding and all the trades connected with it languished. Such was the price of an alliance with a power bent on war to the finish with Great Britain. Nor did France offer any compensatory advantages. The army of occupation, frequently undisciplined and always demanding, paid for its requisitions until 1797 in worthless assignats. And for commercial purposes, the sister republic was treated anything but fraternally. High tariff barriers excluded Dutch manufacturers from what was now Europe's largest area of free exchange, and they cut off Dutch territories lost in 1795 from economic partners of immemorial standing. The unemployment resulting from these disruptions placed intolerable strains in turn on a system of poor relief that had once been the envy of Europe. A disestablished church now demanded funds for its upkeep that had hitherto gone, partly at least, to charity, and the role of pastors in coordinating relief was no longer unquestioned. In the greater cities, between 1.25% of the population found itself demanding relief, and municipalities went deeply into debt to provide it. Even then, it was never enough. In a once flourishing fishing port, an English traveler observed nothing but impoverishment and decay. The harbor was crowded with fishing vessels no longer employed. The quay was covered in long grass, and a melancholy assemblage of beggars importuned us for relief wherever we walked. By the end of the century, these tribulations had brought widespread disillusionment with the friendship and protection of France. Yet no serious movement to break the link ever took shape. Even if it had been possible to renounce treaty obligations to so overwhelming a partner, there was no practical alternative. Neutrality was unsustainable without armed forces of unimaginable size and loyalty. Recalling the Prince of Orange for so long, the natural response when republicanism failed meant subservience to Great Britain, from where Louis V was issuing manifestos even more intransigent than those of Louis XVIII. British commanders during the invasion of 1799 reported that there was no natural groundswell of support for a prince likely to be even more of a foreign puppet than the directors in The Hague. Perhaps this was because, despite repeated interference at every turn of the political roundabout in Paris, for much of the time the Dutch were left to run their internal affairs in their own way. This could hardly be said of other territories overrun by the French. The first conquests of the revolutionary armies had been in Belgium. And during the first occupation in 1792 through 3, the armies of Dumouriez looked on as enemy territory to be used and exploited to the full. The decrees annexing it to France in the spring of 1793 came too close to the Austrian reconquest to bring about any change in treatment. When the French returned in June 1794, Belgium was once more dealt with as occupied enemy territory rather than a reconquered part of the Republic. Debate was certainly reopened in Paris on the drawbacks and advantages of reannexation. But while it went on, Belgium was exploited for all it was worth. War taxes were levied, requisitions imposed to feed and supply the occupying armies, and as usual, any compensation, if paid at all, came in assignats. In Belgium, declared Carnot on 11 July, the French must take all we can, strip it, because it is a country devoted to the Emperor with plenty of restitution to make to France. Everything useful to the French war effort was to be removed, and targets totaling 109 millions in cash were set, though far from achieved, for military levies. A tellingly named Agency for Trade and Extraction was established to coordinate the pillage, and its rapacity soon embarrassed even the representatives on mission. The chorus of complaint, in a language, too, that the French could understand, was deafening. And as 1794 drew to a close, policy makers in Paris began to realize that the long-term repercussions of such a policy might seriously outweigh its short-term advantages. In February 1795, the commercial agency was dissolved, and in August, 9 territorial departments were established as the channels for all governmental action. The palimpsest of territories and jurisdictions which had survived a decade of attempts, whether Austrian or Patriot, to reform it was thus finally rationalized. Complaints were numerous as the proposed new boundaries and jurisdictions were revealed. But anything seemed better than the anarchy and extortion of the preceding 12 months. And common sense of the organization was soon widely acknowledged. But nobody could doubt, after the introduction of a French pattern of administration, what the next step would be. France had by now gained a slice of Dutch territory south of the Rhine mouths and forced the Batavian Republic to recognize the reopening of the Scheldt. It was unthinkable to leave a no man's land behind these gains, for all the warnings of respected figures like Carnot that the natural frontiers proclaimed in 1793 were a formula for interminable war. And so, on 1st October 1795, in one of its last acts, the convention decreed the incorporation of Belgium into the French Republic. Requisitions and extraordinary taxation now stopped. The Belgians had become citizens of the land of liberty and were to enjoy all its benefits. Patriots soon overcame their disappointment at not being allowed to reestablish their independence and threw themselves into making the new order work. But as the more controversial laws of the Republic were progressively introduced, they found themselves increasingly isolated as the tools of a state bent on more than administrative reorganization. Above all, administrators in Belgium were charged with introducing French religious policy. The French had not been heedless of the notorious devotion of the Belgian population during the conquest, and although blasphemous outrages inevitably occurred in churches, particularly monastic ones, were sometimes stripped of their more lavish ornaments. Official policy was one of restraint. The Belgians felt reassured when the Republic officially turned its back on both de-Christianization and factitious deistic cults to declare itself religiously neutral. Yet with a paper money nominally backed by ecclesiastical properties spiraling downwards out of control, the rulers of France looked with growing greed at the still intact Church of Lands of Belgium. In September 1796, therefore, most monasteries were dissolved and their lands put on the market. 10,000 of their inmates were turned out. At the same time, Paris priests lost the function of registering births, marriages, and deaths. But buyers for confiscated church lands were not easily found, and in the first French elections in which the new departments participated, those of 1797, Belgian hostility to these policies was reflected in the return of right-wing candidates. After the Fructidor coup neutralized these results, the Belgian clergy were further traumatized by the oath of hatred for royalty, which met with a massive refusal, particularly in Flemish-speaking areas. The post-Fructidorian Directory had no patience with such resistance, and a special effort was made to purge the presumed leaders of this movement. Almost 600 Belgian non-jurors were condemned to deportation and thereby, of course, lost their benefices. The mistakes of the Vendée were being repeated in a territory where the prestige and authority of parish priests was just as strong. The Jourdan Law was conscription of September 1798 completed the familiar picture. The first attempts to apply it, drafting able-bodied young Flemish peasants into the French army, provoked riots early in October, and by the end of the month, they had blossomed into a full-scale riot. With a tame sister republic to the north, the Belgian departments were lightly garrisoned by troops not expecting to be used to keep domestic order. So no sooner had the initial outbreak been contained at the end of October than there were new disturbances further west, perilously close to the coast off which the British were cruising. Further inland, a peasant army had assembled, 10,000 strong at its height, marching under white flags bearing red crosses. They were very poorly armed, although the British hurriedly attempted to smuggle supplies into them, and attracted few leaders from the upper ranks of society. Nor did many townsmen join them, and when they took towns, they scarcely had time to burn archives, cut down trees of liberty, and sack the homes of public officials before hurriedly withdrawing again at the first approach of troops. Modeling themselves quite consciously on the Vendéens, they also shared their lack of long-term objectives. Though some shouted, "Long live the Emperor," most adopted the slogan, "For land and religion," merely wanting to be left alone with their familiar priests and their sons, not being butchered on distant battlefields, for the benefit of a republic, once more exulting in its own godlessness. But they had none of the Vendéen savagery and caused little bloodshed. The same was true of a contemporaneous uprising, which took place further south in Luxembourg. The response of the French, however, was not so gentle. Flying columns harried rebel territory throughout late November, and on 5th December, the remnants of the peasant army were surrounded at Hasselt. Lacking cavalry themselves, over 700 were hacked to death by French horsemen. Others scattered and went to ground, imitating the Chouans. But by July 1799, the last of them had been caught, with arms in their hands, were shot. Although altogether the casualties of the rebellion numbered around 5,600. In the mass deportation of the entire Belgian clergy, 7,500 priests in all, was decreed. In the event, not more than 500 were rounded up, but the drive against them did nothing to conciliate those who had rebelled. And passive resistance to conscription continued. Of the 22,000 recruits expected from the Belgian departments, only just over 5,000 had materialized by the end of 1799, and these came overwhelmingly from the towns. Rural Belgium, therefore, remained unreconciled to French rule. The urban response was more pragmatic, despite a 50% rise in taxes since the time of Austrian rule and considerable economic disruption. Free access to the French national market promised opportunities for recovery in calmer times. Within a few years, they materialized. In Belgium, industry, undisturbed by the ravages of ummies again until 1814, was able to take profitable advantage of them. Nor were the Belgian bourgeoisie as reluctant as the peasantry to buy nationalized church lands. In Flemish areas, they even embraced the French language as never before. Yet they showed little interest in public affairs and were content to be administered by French officials as they previously had been, until the reforms of Joseph II by imperial ones. They no more felt French than they had previously felt Austrian. It might have been different if the calm times of rule from Paris after 1799 had not been preceded by 6 years of rapine and exploitation from the same quarter. When the annexation of Belgium was decreed on 1st October 1795, the mover of the proposal, Merlin de Douai, also recommended the annexation of the entire left bank of the Rhine. After all, it too lay within the natural frontiers, and French ummies were in occupation of it. Much of it had been annexed once before, in 1793, just like Belgium. But those who were unhappy about even Belgian annexation, on the grounds that it would prolong the war indefinitely, saw greater disadvantages still in incorporating the Rhineland. The Austrians had already written Belgium off, so only Great Britain would now oppose its annexation to France. And with no footholds left on the continent, she could be ignored. But innumerable states had territorial interests and claims in the Rhineland, and to brush them aside would create countless perpetual enmities. Far better to use the occupied territory as a bargaining counter to secure a lasting peace. Besides, French agents on the spot were uncertain about the likely benefits of annexation. All these people, wrote a civil commissioner with the occupying army of the Sambre et Meuse, detest us most cordially. They love only their priests, their princes, and their emperor. Let us deal with them as we deal with a vanquished enemy. Besides, what purpose would be served by joining the country to France? Such arguments prevailed in 1795, and the Rhineland remained outside the Republic's frontiers. In the spring of 1797, it was even briefly suggested that a Cis-Renan sister republic be created. The idea came from Hoche, now commanding on the Rhine and looking for any opportunity to offset the ever-growing personal empire of Bonaparte in Italy by creating a puppet state of his own to rival the Cisalpine Republic. The idea died with Hoche in September 1797, the same month that saw the removal of Carnot, the main opponent of the natural frontiers, from the Directory. Among those remaining was Rebel, himself from Alsace and a long-standing advocate of Rhineland annexation. But even he could not secure immediate satisfaction. While at the Peace of Campo Formio, the next month, the Austrians recognized that the left bank should be French. The consent of the Holy Roman Empire, including Prussia, which also had left bank territories, was left to be worked out at the Congress of Rastatt. It was only obtained and then under threat in December 1798. It remained provisional until France had overcome the Second Coalition in 1801. But long before then, practical assimilation had begun. In January 1798, the occupied territory was divided into 4 departments, and thenceforward the region was governed to all intents and purposes as part of France. The Rhineland, however, was very different from Belgium. It had no history of resistance to established authorities before the French arrived, and there were hardly any local Jacobins or self-styled patriots sympathetic to the revolution, on whose collaboration they could rely. None of the inhabitants spoke French as a native tongue, and few understood it. Above all, the Rhineland was frontline territory for as long as hostilities lasted, and expected to sustain huge French armies long after. The garrison of Belgium had been reduced to a few thousands. Consequently, the military exploitation, which in Belgium lasted for scarcely 3 years in all, went on in Germany for at least twice that length of time. It reduced an area that had been prosperous and flourishing before the 1790s to an enfeebled shadow, systematically stripped and restripped of its wealth and assets in order to sustain armies that the home government could not pay and positively urged to live off the country. We had no kind of financial resources whatsoever, reminisced one veteran of Rhineland campaigns. We had no kind of administrative organization to deal with requisitions. We had to live as best we could, and off the resources of the region in which we found ourselves. Resources were soon exhausted, especially as the Ummies had crossed and recrossed this territory several times. One can't imagine the distress of the Ummie. It could exist only by plundering. Everything useful to an Ummie on the move was taken. Horses, fodder, carts, grain, livestock. Troops were billeted on households and pillaged and abused their hosts without compunction. Able-bodied men and boys were requisitioned for forced labor to dig fortifications and establish camps. The arrival of more ordered conditions meant that exploitation became more systematic. Forced loans and military taxes were now imposed, and requisitions were now paid for in assignats. Attempts to pay the new levies in assignats, however, were understandably not welcomed, and moves towards incorporating the Rhineland into the Republic, the salvation of Belgium, only compounded the problems of France's German subjects. In July 1798, French customs posts were established along the Rhine. They transformed it at a blow from an artery of commerce holding together an economic region comprising both banks into a frontier, as in the southern Netherlands. Nothing, noted observers of the Rhineland scene, had done more to alienate the Rhinelanders from French rule, and only smugglers made any gains. But a large portion of the riverbank population now fell into this category, in constant clashes with customs officers, almost institutionalized their hostility to the new order. Much of the economic life of the pre-revolutionary Rhineland had revolved around servicing the lavish courts of ecclesiastical princes, such as the archbishops of Trier and Cologne, and the residential towns where they were located. The French invasion shattered this pattern forever. The prince-bishops, their courtiers, and their chapters fled beyond the Rhine, and their goods and lands were confiscated by the invaders. Overnight, thousands were deprived of employment in the luxury and service trades that were the lifeblood of these little capitals. Even those who might have hoped to benefit from the secularization of so much church property were disappointed. The French maintained the feudal dues payable to former lords until the spring of 1798, a source of revenue too valuable to be sacrificed to universal principles. The same applied to the tithe, levied no longer for the upkeep of priests, but for that of the French ummies, as in France when it was abolished in March 1798. An equivalent sum was added to rents. Thus, there were no compensations for the sacrilege visited on the church, its buildings, and its customs by the invading ummies. Always the last bastions of a de-Christianization long burnt out in France, even when local laws were brought into harmony with those of France. From 1797 onwards, it was at a time when directorial policy was fiercely anti-clerical, and parades of devotion, so characteristic of Rhenish Catholicism, were prohibited. Priests naturally bore the brunt of these policies, and French suspicions that they were the main ringleaders of resistance were entirely justified. Throughout the occupation, therefore, German priests were expelled, exiled, and arrested, not certainly on the scale attempts in Belgium, but quite enough to keep the resentment of their pious congregations bubbling. Yet the Rhineland experienced no mass uprisings of the sort seen in Belgium and Luxembourg. Rumors of these outbreaks spread into Germany rapidly enough in autumn of 1798 and led to an upsurge in lawlessness and defiance of French authority. Liberty trees were cut down, officials intimidated, and inflammatory leaflets were circulated, urging all good Germans to rise up against the oppressors. The authorities were genuinely alarmed, but no general movement emerged. There were too many French soldiers in occupation, and the last straw in the Belgian case, conscription, was not introduced in a territory not yet fully part of France. Passive resistance was the German way, but even that was effective enough to make French officials compare parts of the Rhineland to the Vendée. "I have not yet found one district," reported a French general on his arrival in 1792, "which really wants to be free." 5 years later, nothing had changed. "Never expect any affection," warned a civil official, "from people who yearn for slavery." Clearly, the revolution had even cast a blight on language. If the German experience of French rule was freedom, words were losing their accepted meaning. For the great nation, however, staggering through, she was from one coup against representative institutions to another. Liberty could only be French. Particular problems arose when she confronted peoples with her own traditions and rhetoric of freedom. The Dutch were one such case. The Swiss were another. The Swiss Confederation was a loose association of sovereign territories, unequal in every way. Its complexity almost beggared description, and it had no central authority to lend it coherence. Any such authority would have set unacceptable limits to the vaunted freedoms of each constituent part. Nor had external threats led to the Swiss to think within living memory that such an authority was desirable for other reasons. No great power coveted this mountainous heart of Europe, and it had no great strategic significance until 1796. It was French conquests in northern Italy that transformed the situation. Switzerland now bestrode the Alpine passes which linked France most conveniently with her client states and major sources of foreign booty in the plains of the Po. More perceptive Swiss saw at once that this would mean increased French interference in their affairs. In order not to be overwhelmed, thought Peter Ox, a leading member of the Basler Patriciat, the Confederation must transform itself into a unitary state. Inevitably, that would mean adopting many French-style institutions and principles, and abandoning many hallowed traditions and liberties. But if Switzerland did not to some degree imitate France, she would remain the helpless prey not only of France itself, but equally probably of her Austrian rival. No sooner had the Peace of Campo Formio been signed, in fact, than the Directory turned its attention to Switzerland. La Harpe, an exile in Paris, for long-standing advocacy of French intervention to emancipate the Francophone Vaud district from the tutelage of German-speaking Bern, urged Rubel to invite Ox to Paris to discuss the reform of what the Directory already regarded as a crazy, formless assemblage of governments without any connection, some oligarchic, others democratic, all despotic, and all enemies of the French Republic. When Ox arrived in December 1797, he found that Bonaparte was also party to the discussions. He was asked to draft a constitution for a one and indivisible Swiss Republic, which would come into being when the Swiss themselves, on a signal from France, rose up to overthrow the old order. That signal would be the annexation by France of outlying northern and western parts of the Confederation, the cities of Mulhouse and Geneva.